Hello everyone. Today, I will talk about the relationship between Alzheimer's disease, autism and the default mode network. What is the default mode network? I will here summarize the default mode network. The default mode network is the neuronal activity exhibited by a vaguely awake and resting brain without any thought, interest or attention. There are multiple areas of the brain that are active only at rest, from the posterior cingulate gyrus and precuneus, medial prefrontal cortex, and so on, and synchronize with each other. This network is involved in self-awareness, orientation and memory. You can see the brain regions of the default mode network. It includes the posterior cingulate gyrus and the precuneus, medial prefrontal cortex, inferior parietal lobe, lateral temporal cortex, anterior temporal pole, hippocampus and parahippocampal gyrus. In the default mode network, three major regions act as hubs of brain function. The functional hub is a key part of the network of brain tissues and is important for facilitating the exchange of vast amounts of information. The first hub is the posterior cingulate gyrus and the precuneus. The second hub is the medial prefrontal cortex. The third hub is the inferior parietal lobe. In the first hub region, the posterior cingulate gyrus and the precuneus, ventral posterior cingulate gyrus is activated in all tasks, involving those related to the self and others, recall of the past, imagination of the future, and concept processing and spatial navigation. The dorsal posterior cingulate gyrus is involved in involuntary awareness and arousal. The precuneus is also involved in visual, sensorimotor, and attentional information. The second hub region is the medial prefrontal cortex. This region is involved in decisions regarding self-processing, such as personal information, autobiographical memories, future goals and events, and decision-making concerning individuals who are very close, such as family members. This ventral region is involved in positive emotional information and internally valued rewards. The third hub region, inferior parietal lobe, mainly consists of the angular gyrus. This region is involved in perception, attention, spatial cognition, and behavior and supports episodic memory recall. The default mode network has two subsystems. The first is the dorsal medial subsystem. The second is the medial temporal subsystem. Dividing the dorsal medial subsystem into three parts, the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex is responsible for socially oriented thinking, such as determination or inference of the purpose of another's behavior. The lateral temporal cortex performs retrieval of semantic and conceptual knowledge. The anterior temporal pole is involved with conceptual information, particularly that social in nature. In the medial temporal subsystem, the hippocampus is involved in new memories, and is also involved in remembering the past and imagining the future. The parahippocampal gyrus is involved in space and scene recognition and simulation. You can see the relationship between these three functional hubs and the two subsystems. The posterior cingulate gyrus and the precuneus and medial prefrontal cortex are always collaborative in activity. The other functional hub, the inferior parietal lobe and two subsystems, is not always collaborative with the activity of the posterior cingulate gyrus and the precuneus and medial prefrontal cortex. Let's look at the activity of the default mode network in the awake resting state of a healthy subject on functional brain imaging. Glucose metabolism PET, brain perfusion SPECT, and arterial spin labeling of MRI show high perfusion and metabolism in the posterior cingulate gyrus and precuneus and medial prefrontal cortex. In Alzheimer's disease dementia, amyloid SS protein accumulates in this default mode network, the posterior cingulate gyrus and the precuneus and medial prefrontal cortex. The activity of the default mode network, which is high during waking and resting states, decreases during a task. Comparison of brain perfusion before and during Shiratori, Japanese word chain game, using arterial spin labeling of MRI shows reduced perfusion in posterior cingulate gyrus and precuneus and medial prefrontal cortex during Shiratori. Alzheimer's disease and autism are two well-known disorders in which this default mode network is disrupted. In Alzheimer's disease, the network is markedly disrupted in the functional hubs of the posterior cingulate gyrus and precuneus, medial prefrontal cortex, and inferior parietal lobes. With regard to autism, it has been shown that in healthy individuals, the default mode network is formed gradually during development of childhood. The formation of the default mode network may be related to social gains such as communication with others. Communication disorders in autism may be caused by poorly formed default mode network. This concludes the relationship between Alzheimer's disease, autism and the default mode network. Thank you for watching.